Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to an episode of the Artenders with Mac and Dan. I am Dan, he is Mac.
Hi!
We're doing something weird, interesting, yes, both.
Just the choice?
Just a choice, I don't know. But it's one of the biggest TV shows out there right now. I think certainly probably the biggest animated TV show. It is crude, it is crass, also partially insightful. This show is Rick and Morty. Mac, this was your selection, and it took us a bit to get here with us being in Dallas and then having a snowstorm kind of impede our progress in terms of reviewing this show. But now we're here, we're in one room, and now we can finally discuss this show that was created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon. So, Mac, I really want to get off the bat. Why did you pick this show for this show?
So, I was watching through the entire series again whenever season 4 came out. Because it's a pretty short series, to be honest.
Yeah, no, it's not terribly long, yeah.
Not at all. And I think that's because apparently it is a bitch to animate. Like, I was watching an interview with a couple of the people that are on the show, that work on the show.
Right.
And they were talking about how they've already written through season 8.
What?
They've already written 8 seasons. And, like, unchanged, they're like, yeah, no, this is what the story is for 8 seasons, right? And because they've already been signed on for 10.
Oh, my God.
By Adult Swim.
Oh,
yeah.
my God.
And that's why they went to, like, a poorer network like Adult Swim, is because they were like, you know, we could go and be a pretty good show for, you know, Netflix or whatever. Yeah. Or we could rule a network.
Which is truly what they've done.
Absolutely. I mean, they're the only Adult Swim show that people give a shit about anymore.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like Game of Thrones and HBO.
Yeah.
The Game of Thrones was like, okay, well, we could go somewhere else, or we could dominate HBO for however long we're on.
And like it's another case too that it's not necessarily like Game of Thrones is not the only thing on HBO, but so much of the time, like you think of HBO, then probably the first show that will pop into your mind is Game of Thrones.
Right.
And that is certainly the case with Adult Swim, which is on, if you don't know, Cartoon Network, but very late at night.
Yeah, very specific audience that tunes in for that.
Yes.
And so they were talking about how, they've written 8 seasons so far, and the recording takes no time at all. Like, they can record an entire season in a few days.
Yeah.
But it's just animating. They hand draw every freaking frame.
Yeah.
It takes forever. And so it takes, like, a couple years to crank out, 10 episodes, 20 minutes apiece.
Yeah.
Which is hilarious to think about.
And
how
the joke,
hard that is
and the joke, not the joke, sorry, the show makes it a joke. It goes a little bit meta, and that's probably a word that you're going to hear a lot during this episode, how often this show does meta things.
Yeah.
Like it addresses the sort of fourth wall and like what's actually happening in the show.
Right.
And the show addresses a season takes like a year and a half, and I think at the very end of either season 2 or season 3, it's like, okay, guys, see you in a year and a half from now.
Yeah. One thing that I appreciate so much about the way that they treat their meta moments and the fourth wall breaks is that they are aware of the fact they're in a show.
Yes.
Yeah. But what's so impressive is that they're not aware that they're not real people. They're still fully real people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is partially what makes it so funny, right? And so they have made a perfect show and characters for commercials, for shorts. I've seen a bunch of commercials since season 4 came out, a bunch of commercials. And so, like, there was one commercial for the PS5 where Morty is just sitting there and he is saying the exact script that PS5 gave them, like word for word, and he keeps looking back at Rick, and Rick keeps going like, yeah, keep going. And the entire time that Morty is like stumbling through this commercial script, Rick's just counting money in the background. He's just counting all the money they got from the PS5 commercial, and then he's like, Rick, I don't know what to say anymore. And then Rick he chimes in and he's like, okay, and then he just looks straight at the camera and he's like, buy the PS5, it rocks, suck a dick. And like that's all they have to do.
For those of you who don't know, Rick and Morty is essentially about a extremely drunk but crazy mad scientist, incredibly intelligent grandfather named Rick, and his mostly incompetent high school grandson Morty. And they essentially go on adventures for the most part every episode. We see some episodes divert from the formula for good reasons, right? But that is the basis of the show. But as to sort of what you were speaking to, Mac, and kind of like a big reason why probably that some of the recording takes a very short amount of time to perform is that it feels, and it definitely is, that so much of this show is sort of improvisational.
Yeah.
You have a lot of characters in this show that is played by one of the creators, Justin Roiland. Justin Roiland plays both Rick and Morty, and does actually a very, very good job of making those characters really, really distinct, both emotionally and vocally. It is impressive that if you told me at the get-go, hey, those two characters, same person. That is ridiculous because of how difficult it is, especially in a scene where really the only person you have to go off of is yourself.
Yeah.
So it's really tricky to actually cultivate conflict for your character when you're just looking in the mirror.
And funny enough, he has gone on record many times saying that that is actually how he prefers it. That he didn't realize that he would like that at first, and then once he was given that opportunity to play both characters in a scene, all of a sudden he was like, oh wait, acting is so easy when I'm the one giving myself stimuli.
It's the equivalent of that Pixar short where I think it's the Pixar short for Toy Story 2, where the old man is either Toy Story 1, where the old man is playing chess.
Yes.
With himself.
Yeah,
and that is exactly what Justin Roiland does with this character.
Yeah, that makes sense.
He also plays a multitude of other side characters in this show.
There are so many.
But it kind of gets to a point like, oh, that's Justin Roiland. Oh, that's Justin Roiland again. Oh, that's Justin Roiland.
Right.
Could they not get anybody else to do that? Okay, it's Justin Roiland improving, shooting the shit again, once again.
But that is also one of the most charming parts about the show that I love so much, is that it's so fun. And you can feel the fun that all the creators and writers and actors are having as the show is happening. Everyone on this project is having a good-ass time at all times, which is really refreshing. And you can see that in episodes, I know we're going to talk about it a bunch, I'm sure, but like Intergalactic Cable.
Okay, so interdimensional cable. But so Mac, I want you to answer this question very plainly. It's going to be a yes or no question, and I doubt you really have to think on it much.
I bet I can guess your question.
Do you like the interdimensional cable episodes? There are only really two. Yeah. There are two others that kind of shoot in that vein, but
they
they're
even
only
say
yes, and they say, "Hey, we're doing this instead of interdimensional cable,"
which is hilarious.
Just for the two episodes that are actually interdimensional cable, which are episodes where Rick and Morty are watching TV, but it's TV from like alternate dimensions. So you may have like a commercial for this really bad Bad Boys ripoff, for example, which is probably one of the better ones. It's just absurd stuff like that, or Real Fake Doors, like a commercial for that.
Right.
So do you like interdimensional cable?
I do.
Oof.
I know you don't.
I really hate those episodes.
Yeah, and of course you don't, because you're a big fan of structure and plot and moving story.
Yeah, so those
and this is the exact opposite.
And exactly. Those two episodes, you get some plot in them. Like, in the very first... in the very first interdimensional cable, what it feels like, it's like 15 minutes of fluff.
Yeah.
And then at the very end, it's like, oh, actual character development between Beth and Jerry, who are Morty's parents. Actual character development there. I had to sit through 20 minutes, like 15 to 20 minutes of sort of improv, at least to me, right?
Sure.
Because my issue with a lot of the improv in this show is that I feel like anybody can do it.
Yeah.
And I understand, like, that's a lot of fun to do in a room and to experience live.
Yeah.
But when you're watching also a television show that is, as you said, painstakingly animated, it's like, oh, so this is how you allocated your time?
Yeah.
Like, I don't necessarily need the show to be highfalutin, right? Like, I think Kayla Cobb of Decider says it really, really well. of the show. It's a never-ending fart joke wrapped around a studied look into nihilism, which is the best explanation you can give of the show, and not every episode has to do that. I understand. True. Like, that's just how the nature of some television shows work, where most of the episodes cover its own plot, right? But I still have a problem with those interdimensional cable episodes because it just meanders into nowhere, right? So I think the really, really clever part that the show does, and does really, really well, and it's one of my favorite parts about the show, is that on the outside, it's a fart joke. It's nothing. It's just this sort of shtick that's being thrown around everywhere. It's slapstick, it's poop and pee and sexual jokes everywhere, and that is the bread and butter of the show, right? But then when you actually think about what is happening, like plot-wise and character-wise within episodes, for most of them, you're actually sort of getting an inside look into a character's psyche and their sort of usually insecurities that bubble really in that episode. I think season 3 does a really good job of that, where nearly every episode visits a character's insecurity with how it relates to Beth and Jerry's divorce. And they just divorced for that one season. And so you may get an episode, like the second episode, where it's like the Mad Max episode, and it looks at Summers, who is Morty's sister, her vulnerabilities and her insecurities when it comes to that sort of divorce. Then you also get another episode, and multiple episodes, where it's Jerry and he is dating this crazy warrior alien, and it's a very clear look, comedically of course, but a very clear look into his own insecurities and him trying to prove himself to his now ex-wife. And I think the show does an incredible job of that. So that's what makes interdimensional cable, finally bringing it back around, so frustrating for me, is because it doesn't do that, period. That I know pretty certainly, because it reads off the screen how much fun it is for those actors and for those directors, for those people in that booth to just do that, right?
Yes.
But when it's kind of borderline not really that funny, and maybe it's funny the first time, and I think I probably laughed a bunch the first time, but then rewatching at least those 2 episodes the second time, because I watched this season with you, I believe, a few years ago, the series, the first 3 seasons at least, and then rewatching it again sort of last week and the week before, that it's just a whole lot of nothing.
True.
And so the fart jokes, what makes those fart jokes really, really good is that there's something underneath, and those fart jokes don't have anything underneath. Mm-hmm. And it just becomes unfunny to me, at the very least, the second time viewing.
Yeah, okay, so I would say it really does have a lot to do with what you find funny, because I would agree that the jokes themselves are not that funny.
Yeah. And there are a lot of pop culture references, which is probably going to make the show not age well at all. Like in one episode, I believe it's season 4, they referenced Ant-Man and the Wasp. And I want to let you know that I saw Ant-Man and the Wasp in theaters, and I have already forgotten that movie. That when they brought it up, I had to sit there for a good 2 minutes, and I'm like, so what was that movie about? I can't even remember.
Ant-Man and the Wasp,
and they made a joke about that movie. That joke is going to die the moment it reaches your ears 5 years at the most in the future.
Yeah. And I don't think that the jokes themselves are particularly golden or bulletproof.
Right.
But for me, I'm just so thrilled by the concept, purely because I haven't seen it before.
Yes. The premises are immaculate.
Yeah, and so whenever it comes to interdimensional cable, I'm sitting there and I can't wipe the smile off my face, purely because they're doing things that I'm just shocked that they're allowed to do. Uh-huh. I'm sitting there, I'm like, oh my gosh, someone's actually letting them get away with this? This is insane. Like, how far can you really take it? And they really push the limits. And I think that they push the limits of the show in several different ways, but that specific detail, that specific way in which they push past anything that I've ever seen another show do is specifically funny to me. So they could be saying literally anything. It could absolutely be no jokes whatsoever, and I would still be smiling, thinking to myself, I'm shocked that I'm watching this right now.
One of my favorite episodes in the show is an episode called Rattlestar Galactica. Yeah. By the way, every single episode title is a reference to some sort of movie, usually, or sometimes a TV show. But here, this episode is about this snake race that I'm trying to remember it perfectly, but Morty sends a snake from Earth over to this snake-infested planet. Like, this planet is completely run by snakes, and they've been at complete civil war due to race, of all things. Which Rick pokes fun at. It's like, oh, so that's funny. All they're doing is because of race. Like, they're, it's sort of poking fun at the fact of the mirror being held, but snakes are experiencing that too.
Yeah, right. And they have a very similar history, apparently.
Yes.
Like,
and so
end up being the same.
Morty gets bit by a snake astronaut. They kill it, and Morty gets, the poison that entered into his bloodstream.
And also, it's like while they're out in space, right?
Exactly.
So he starts suffocating too.
Exactly. But luckily, Rick helped create an antidote and cured Morty of this venom that entered into his bloodstream. Now, Morty felt guilty. Oh, so this snake died, and this snake society is going to have no idea about just what happened to that snake. So him feeling guilty, he got a snake at like a PetSmart and then found a way to drop off this snake and pose it as the astronaut in this society. And then it becomes these snakes figuring out that there is life outside of their planet, and they all band together, and it becomes this insane but wacky and zany Terminator episode. And a bunch of snakes from the future are traveling back in time and are trying to kill each other left and right. And so much of this show and this series, it's a parody of other things, right? But I think what makes a show excel in so many points is that even if you don't pick up the references and premises like that, the jokes still sort of the premises still stand alone by themselves, right? So in reference to the individual jokes that are written, not all of them are going to land, and probably a big part of them are probably not even written in the script. It's probably saying, hey, Justin, just say a funny thing. Hey, Chris Parnell, say just a very loser thing that Jerry would say. But when it comes to the sort of plot mountain that they construct, the world, the very, very small 20-some minute world that they construct for an episode, for the most part, 9 times out of 10, I am always ridiculously impressed by the amount of creativity that goes into it. Because I sit back every episode and I think to myself, man, I could never think of that.
Yeah.
But it's this weird dichotomy, right? At least to me, in my experience, where you get these insanely creative premises, and then sometimes the dialogue is not very creative at all. Yeah. And so I think, but it also speaks to what the show is saying / doing, that on surface level, it's very, very stupid. And the show is very, very stupid. But the show also makes sure to address themes such as loneliness and like I said before, insecurities. Those are very big things thematically in the show, and you don't have to be super duper intelligent to understand, hey, those are the things that this show is speaking to in some of these episodes. But I think that's where this show succeeds the most. And so with the case of Rattlestar Galactica, that show kind of addresses a little bit into Morty's guilt factor of him needing to supply this alien snake race with answers and trying to give them hope, and completely contrasting his foil Rick with not giving a shit all matters of the day. And we see that so much of the case with Rick throughout the series, where he doesn't give a shit, and that is both to Rick's betterment and most of the time to Rick's detriment with how his relationship is with the rest of the characters of the show. And so the show is a very light-hearted sort of factor that it's doing, but then you also have these characters go through heartbreak in this very meaningful way, and the show isn't afraid to address that, but the show also isn't afraid to immediately dip out of that. Right. And it's 100% doing it on purpose, because they're saying, look, the show is kind of about this, but, I mean, this show wouldn't be this show if we spent an entire 30 minutes on these two characters crying about their problems.
Yes. I would say that, wrapping back around like 20 minutes later, to why I picked this show in the first place.
Yeah.
It is because I was watching the show. I was watching the show back over again, and I was doing it with Emma, my girlfriend, right? And we've watched 2 seasons already. We're starting the 3rd season.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, in the middle of, I think, episode 2 of season 3, she says, wait, I'm confused. I'm like, what do you mean? And she was like, I think I missed something. And I was like, what do you mean?
I want to put a quick pin. Has Emma seen the show prior to this
Never
point?
Before.
Okay.
And she's like, wait, I think I'm confused. And I'm like, why? And she's like, I think that I might have missed something. And I was like, what do you mean? And she was like, well, to be honest, I was kind of texting through the first 2 seasons because I thought that this was just some dumb show.
Yeah.
And now I'm realizing I actually needed to pay attention because it's actually a show that's starting to give me plot all of a sudden. Like, I'm actually starting to learn things about the characters, and they're starting to make references to past episodes, and it's starting to get a lot more complex in season 3 and season 4. That I think is the reason that I like this show so much, is because it is so deceptive in how clever it is.
Yeah.
It's not clever at face value, just like you said, but the longer you watch and the more you sit and think with the show, not like about the show, but as long as you sit and think with the show, you start realizing, oh my gosh, this show is really, really stellar and a lot better than I had given it credit for, because it doesn't ask you to give it much respect.
No, not at all. No, it actually, I feel like it asks you to give it no respect, period.
Yes, and I think that is one of the most clever things they do.
Yeah.
Like you're talking about the heavy moments and how they're willing to dip out of them. I have to say that all 3 of my favorite moments in terms of comedy, the times in which I laughed the absolute hardest, heaving laughter, are all like maybe some of the most depressing moments of the show. And they're not like slapstick, like punchline jokes.
Yeah.
It's just we sit in absolute depression, and it's hilarious.
Could you give...
I'd be happy to.
Oh, please.
I'd be happy to.
Oh,
so
take the words right out of my mouth. Just like a clown.
Like a clown.
Pulling all the fabric.
So, one of my favorites is Rick makes a robot that its only, do you know what I'm talking about? Its only purpose is to hand Rick the butter, because the butter is across the table.
And it's at the very beginning of an episode.
Yeah,
and they don't really go back to it at all. Yeah. This is just one small joke.
A tiny, tiny bit of back and forth. And Rick says, hey, robot, could you go get the butter? He brings the butter, and then he says, what else am I supposed to do? And Rick says, nothing. You're really just made for butter. And the robot looks down in his hands, and he says, oh my God. And Rick says, welcome to the club. That's so funny. That's so clever. And it really does speak to me. I'm sitting there thinking like, oh man, fucking preach. That you're like, God, I must be made for so much, and then I'm like, what are we really made for?
I am just a small cog in this large wheel.
Oh yeah. And then, there are a bunch of they go on an adventure together, and at first Rick is like, yeah, it's only gonna take like 15 minutes, and then like
2 weeks later,
several weeks later, they are like given this award by a planet, and they are driving away, or they're like flying away or whatever in their spaceship. and they're like trying to keep it together or whatever, and then they just both start sobbing because they're like, "Oh my god, what just happened?" They're
the amount of stress,
the
that
relief
exudes and is finally off their shoulders. That it's hard to explain until you're in that moment where all that stress sort of leaves your body, and just like,
so
and it leaves
funny.
you, and it's just you're just a shell.
Yeah.
You're just a shell at that point. You're like, and you, for the first time in your life, you breathed. You're like, oh my god, and that's exactly what happens in that moment. And you're absolutely correct that the show is definitely at its funniest, at its most depressing moments.
And then my gold medal, actually. Get in my gold medal.
A Gettle.
A Gettle. Get ready. My gold medal actually goes to this one moment. It was the moment I was laughing so hard that I cried, and we had to pause the show for me to calm down because I couldn't keep watching it. I was laughing so hard. That's not an exaggeration.
My God.
We were watching, it's very early, where Rick and Morty make some bad decisions.
Yes.
And so
as they do all the time.
The Earth in their dimension falls apart.
Yes.
And goes into absolute chaos. They're in the apocalypse. Everyone dies except for their family. And Rick and Morty feel so bad about this, they can't keep living in this world anymore. So they teleport to another dimension. And they decide that they're going to live there because it's almost identical to their version of Earth. But they have to kill that dimension's versions of themselves and bury them in the backyard and carry on as if it didn't happen. And it's not like funny and like, oh, let's move on. Like, they really have to emotionally deal with it.
And when you say they, it's definitely just Morty.
Yeah,
and Rick treats it like it's a Tuesday.
Right. And Morty has to wrestle with the fact that he's left his family behind and that he has killed himself and like had to do it with his bare hands, and he's buried in the backyard right now. And
his grandfather is saying, okay, I'll grab my body, you'll grab your body, that's probably the most fair way to do this. It's just as if nothing happened.
Yeah, right.
And in the complete sort of just I don't know how to explain it, but dismissal. It's a complete dismissal on everybody else. There is not a character more selfish probably in media in general than Rick Sanchez.
Yeah, I'd have to say so. Every decision that he makes is purely selfish.
But I think
gross.
And what makes the show sometimes actually really, really interesting is that when you actually get those very, very small, tiny windows of Rick not being selfish. And the show kind of puts itself up to that, right? We were speaking a couple of weeks ago with our friends Izzy and Hannah on Phineas and Ferb, and how a show like that, at least, right? This animated show that each episode has its own plot, that they find their formula and they do a really good job of sticking to the formula and finding different ways just within that formula to spice things up and change it up. So each episode is a unique experience, right? And then occasionally they will break that wheel. They will break that formula where all of a sudden this show throws a sudden curveball that you actually have an episode to bring up the fact that Rick and Morty change directions, that they address it in an episode later on where Morty is talking to Summer and is like, hey, actually, I'm not your real brother. Your real brother is out there buried in the garage. That's insane. Life is meaningless. Do you want to watch TV?
Yeah.
And so...
Oh, it's so relatable, though,
And so the show never really deviates from that formula, but when it does, it's like, oh, you're really actually keeping tabs on the storytelling that you have. And you never forget that this storytelling is literally covered in shit.
Yeah.
But you're always keeping tabs of what you're doing and what you're saying with your people.
And even though they take so many shortcuts and they really give themselves outs, like they really cheat in terms of making the story flow and make sense. And they're like, you know what? If we don't like this storyline, all of a sudden, spaceship crashes into the planet, and no one lives anymore, and so we have to go to a different storyline all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Like, they cut corners big time.
Yeah.
But they really do, like, keep it logically sound in terms of, like the world that they create. They're like, you know what? We're not going to start over every episode. It really is going to track.
Yeah.
And they do a very good job of it, too. Like, exactly like what you just said. I laughed super hard at it, but I totally forgot about the fact that Rick and Morty are buried out in the backyard. And then he brings it up, and I start laughing again because I'm like, holy shit, I forgot that they're buried back there.
And in the first episode of season 3, that becomes relevant because they dig Rick's body in order to get a buried portal gun from the body. So once again, the show keeps incredible tabs on these things. And so each episode is its own sort of world, but there are consequences to things that happen.
Yes. So we're talking about the way in which the show progresses, how it actually does keep tab of its story, how it actually does very deceptively and very, very minimally have a story that they're actually telling from top to bottom. And we were also mentioning the foil between Rick and Morty. And using all those topics, I want to get into a much larger topic when we come back from a break, yeah?
Wow!
All right, if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Now, just let me explain. First of all, it's free. Second of all, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a whole bunch more. And third, now this is really important, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Hear me when I say no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. And welcome back to the Artenders with Mac and Dan. So we left off talking about maybe teasing some of the crazy theories that come out of this show. The fact that there's these huge plots and characters that leave a lot of questions unanswered. But
and you would never expect it from face value to do so, but they absolutely do.
Yeah, they really do. And the exciting part is that the longer you watch the show, you realize that the things they leave unanswered are intentional. It's not like they are just lazy. The writers actually do know exactly what they're doing, which is so relieving, to be honest. So from this show is born endless hours of film theory, of people making up crazy theories about like what the show could be or what things could mean. One of them that makes... So I'll talk about one that's insane, that makes a little bit of sense, and then one that makes a whole lot of sense, that I'm excited to see what happens.
Okay.
The craziest one being, there are a lot of people that believe that the version of Rick, because we're watching just one version of Rick and Morty.
That's right.
The Rickest Rick and the Mortiest Morty.
Yeah.
They believe that our Rick is actually a Morty.
What?
Yeah. Now...
Okay.
Because apparently, in one of the episodes, they very passingly mention that Morty has disguised himself, or one of the Mortys has disguised themselves as Rick C-137.
Right.
And after season 4 ended, they made a couple shorts. They made a couple shorts of of Rick and Morty, and they were not even written or created by Dan Harmon or Justin Roiland. It was by an anime director from Tokyo. And they gave him permission to make anime shorts of Rick and Morty.
This is the first time I'm hearing of this.
Yeah, and so even the cartoon style...
You didn't tell me this during the break?
Oh, well, sorry, I didn't freaking know.
Asshole.
I didn't know. And so they have...
We're going to talk about this later.
They literally have a Rick and Morty... that was entirely designed to be anime, and they're only like eight minutes a pop.
I also want to explain really fast. If you heard like keyboard tapping and clicking in the background, that is because Mac is currently showing me images from this Rick and Morty anime, which it's still very clearly, Western inspired in terms of the character design, particularly the eyes. But it's just so weird, and it's so not what the show is, but it still embodies a lot of the character of what the show represents.
And no one ever claimed that, like, oh yeah, this is Rick and Morty by any means, and they say that several times, like, this is not Rick and Morty, this is just like a funny spin-off that like an anime director made. But in that so they kept saying, don't pay attention to this, don't worry about this, don't worry about this. But there was one of the shorts was about how Rick C-137 is the Rick that we're with.
Okay.
Meaning that it is actually Morty. But Morty has figured out a way to transform his outer shell to make him look like a Rick so that he gets more respect. So that he can reap the benefits of the Citadel of Rick.
So who's the Morty? The Mortiest of Mortys, as you said. Who is the Morty that we are witnessing in this show if it is not body. Morty from Dimension C-137? You say it's in Rick's body? What?
Yes. So it's Evil Morty.
What is this? What? Okay.
You recognize Evil Morty?
Yes, Evil Morty, to explain, is... well, actually, there's not really much to explain now that I'm saying it out loud. Yeah, it's just a Morty who's evil.
Yeah, who swears that he is going to get revenge on all the Ricks that have underestimated the Mortys, and is going to defeat the Ricks.
Because there is an entire society of Ricks and Mortys, and Ricks always have control over their Mortys.
Yes.
And this Morty is going against the grain.
And this idea gives birth to one of the most interesting concepts that the entire show dives into, which is the episode where, for the very first time in this society, in the Citadel of Ricks, a Morty is running for president.
Yes.
In this society. And everyone's like, oh, you're an idiot. You're never going to be voted. No one's ever going to vote a Morty as president. And then it ends up being an evil Morty, and he starts like assassinating all the competitors.
Right. He assassinates everybody in his office that he does not trust / are Ricks that are also very, very selfish.
Right.
And he wants pawns.
Yeah, and so he is able to weasel his way into office, and it's so interesting, and it tells you a lot about the direction in which the show is going. So that was a crazy theory, but this kind of segues into the other theory, which is I actually do believe that this show, because the first two seasons obviously were like, is there really plot here? And then season 3 and 4, there really is. This does start to be conflict and story that's happening.
Yeah.
And I
very
think that,
much so underlying everything that's happening in the show, yes.
And now knowing that they've signed on for a minimum of 10 seasons, I'm thinking to myself, okay, so what is this looking like long term? What's the long-term story that we're getting here? And I think the answer is the conflict between Rick and Morty, because the more time that Morty spends with Rick, the smarter Morty gets. Mm-hmm. But Rick is never going to allow Morty the respect to actually blossom into his potential. Right. He's always going to be underneath Rick.
Because why would he? I mean, like, if you just take a look at Rick, it's very clear he wants to control every situation that is in the room.
Yeah. And so, as you see in seasons 3 and 4, Morty is, like, his arc is really dependent on him wanting more and more and more agency and independence and decision-making power in their adventures. And Rick continuously shitting on him.
Yes.
And telling him that he is worth nothing.
And Rick occasionally allows Morty to make some decisions, but
it's never
exactly. He never looks at Morty as an equal. It is always sort of out of pity and sometimes out of love that he would never admit to.
Never, ever admit to. Yeah.
Never.
And so there are, I can think of a million examples right off the bat in which Rick is telling Morty, you're meaningless and you do not belong here and do not deserve to be here. And so there are a lot of options in terms of where they can go with that. They can go as far as our Morty, the Mortiest of Mortys. Now, I know, I love that we're calling him that. He joins evil Morty and tries to take down Rick. He could just leave Rick behind. He could have a fight so big with Rick that Rick just packs up and leaves. But this tension has been growing for several seasons and is going to have to come to a head.
Yeah.
And that's exciting. You're like, oh my gosh, there's actually story on the horizon. What the hell did that come from?
That as a viewer, you feel enthralled to watch, not because you're watching new, crazy, wacky adventures and premises that are happening and unfolding, but you are also witnessing potential critical story beats that keeps you on that fishhook for just a little bit longer.
Yeah.
That if you just leave this show, then you might have missed that episode that answers a few questions that you had, that is actually, worthwhile answers, right? There is an episode, I think it's at the end of season 2 or season 3, where Beth requests her father to make her a clone. And so one of them will go out and just experience the world for what they want to experience. And so then...
Experience the universe.
Exactly. And so they finally address it again in the very final episode of season 4, where one of the versions of Beth comes back, and Rick and nobody else has any idea which one the clone is. Which Beth Smith is the clone, and he has no idea. Is it the Beth Smith that stayed behind and became the maternal unit of the family, or was it the Beth Smith that became an intergalactic assassin? Yeah. Which one? And he has no idea.
And you find out by, it's not just that he secretly knows. They go back in his memory and watch his memories, because they have the ability to do that. And he took the
and because he deleted this memory.
Yeah, he did. Right. But they bring it back, and you see him have the original Beth in a giant vat, and then the clone Beth in the vat right next to it. They look the exact same. He takes the labels off, and then he just mixes them up so that he doesn't know which is which. And so he literally does not know which is which. And by the way, this wasn't just some storyline that they dropped and picked up again later. For all of season 4, Beth is wrestling with consistently, am I a clone?
She has no idea.
Every once in a while, she's just like, oh yeah. And then she has this in the same way that Morty every once in a while will be on an adventure, and then his mind will trail off, and he'll start thinking about the depressing shit that he's done over the course of the show. Best thing is she's in the middle of a journey, and she will stop and think to herself,
are these real feelings?
Yeah, she's like, I might not be a real person. There's no way of me really knowing. And that's crazy. It's really
And it's
clever.
kind of funny how much that it addresses an ethical thing in science, where that is the reason why we don't make clones. When somebody is a clone, it's I'm even though human life and even having a nihilistic point of view of we're just here to live and then die, that's doubly so when you're a clone, when you are artificially made as science to just live and die. That is your purpose.
And they even hint at it in one of my favorite moments of the entire series. Again, a horribly depressing moment, because you see my brand. So, so it's whenever Rick has made a robot version of Summer and Morty, and Morty and Summer are off on an adventure somewhere else.
Oh my god, you're so right. Ladies and gentlemen, the memories are flooding back into my mind.
And it's directly nodding to Beth's experience.
Exactly.
That you eventually see in season 4. So he has built these bulletproof, awesome robot versions of Morty and Summer.
They are clones essentially as well, but in terms of the AI that exhibits within the minds of these clones, very, 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 very rudimentary.
Yeah, right. And so they're bare bones, but they're very accurate in terms of small talk. So basically they can sit there at dinner and look like the kids, even though they're not. And so After dinner one time, the mom is just like, okay, love you guys. And then you see Morty's robot turn around and he goes, I love you too. No, I don't. Yes, I do. No, I don't. Oh, I want to feel these feelings. No, I can't feel these feelings. No, but I have to feel these feelings. I know I'm not supposed to, but I need to. I want to be a real boy.
I want to hug you, mother. I want to run through a stream butt naked. I want to have these experiences, the feelings. And then he gets shut off immediately.
And then he like just kind of, and he's like rebooting. See you, mother. Love you too. And then he leaves, and the mom's just sitting there and is like, what the fuck? It's so smart. And it's exactly a nod to Beth's eventual experience with the whole, oh my God, am I actually feeling these feelings? I don't know if I am, but I want to.
This show never has to look at a serious, it doesn't even have to be serious, but just character dilemmas, right? Like actual character dilemmas and actual character conflict that this show goes through, excuse me. And a lot of this show is Rick simply being there, addresses a problem, and actually wedges between, two people. So, like, a really good example is Beth and Jerry's marriage. And so Rick being there sort of addresses the problem, hey, this marriage is completely dysfunctional. And Rick also helps ruin that marriage. And I think I really, really appreciate the show because of that. That the show never has to be that. That this show can just be a bunch of poopy fart jokes, because that's also so much of Adult Swim too. Like, it's not the most highfalutin clever of comedy, right? It's just silly stuff that you put on really late at night, maybe with a group of friends. You might be drinking, maybe, smoking out of a bowl or something. Don't do that, kids. And you're just watching the show and you're like, whatever. But I appreciate the show immensely for kind of dabbling in both and knowing when, like we said before, knowing when to dip out of those serious situations, because they know that what makes this show partially so special is that those little character moments or little diamonds in the rough. They're little nuggets that are hiding in a beach, little needle in a haystack, if you will. Yeah. And so once the audience member finds that needle, they reward it, and then immediately, hey, there's another haystack over there. Why don't you go dive into that one? Mac, why don't we address the more solid of theories that you wanted to bring up, as opposed to this wacky Mick. He might as well be Mick because Morty is Rick. Yes, this theory that Morty is Rick, which I find kind of silly, and I'm not really sure if that actually leads to anything interesting. But with that being said, what is the other theory that you want to bring up?
Yeah, the other theory being that at some point Morty is going to, or that Morty is already in cahoots with evil Morty.
I wasn't listening.
Oh, no, it's fine. No, well, I only really touched on it earlier. But to dive deeper, the theory is that it's not only that he's eventually going to pair up with evil Morty, but the Mortys of Mortys is going to actually, he already is in cahoots with the evil Morty, and he is just trying to get as close to Rick as possible so that he infiltrates Rick at an emotional level, because that's the only weak spot of the Rickest Rick. Is that like he has this emotional shell that he's placed around himself, but Morty just breaks it down bit by bit by bit, and then all of a sudden Rick cares about him, because we have seen Rick, the only thing he cares about and the only thing that has any sort of value to him is Morty. And that comes up several times, And
sometimes Morty tries to really pull it out of Rick.
Exactly.
And Rick is not budging.
And so the theory is that maybe the reason that he's trying to pull it out of him is because the more that Rick cares about him, the more control Morty has. Subsequently, the more control evil Morty has. Because evil Morty has kind of surfaced as a potentially series-lasting antagonist.
Yes, I mean, they look at it. It's actually kind of one of my favorite episodes. Sometimes I don't really care for when a show goes meta, but this episode goes so incredibly meta.
Is it like the dome of Morty's?
No, not quite. It is the episode in season 4. It is called Never Ricking Morty, and it is an episode that it's Rick and Morty on a train, but everything on that train is analogous to sort of, I guess, like plot points and narrative storytelling, and how Rick and Morty, these two characters, are also actively trying to break out of the sort of contrived narrative that you would expect, right? And so the biggest of those contrived narratives is this giant face-off with Rick and Morty against evil Morty in this giant army. And it's very clear, I think, at least to me, maybe I shouldn't say very clear, but I feel as if the writers are like, hey, look, this is the easy way out. This is the easy way of us trying to build up an expectation of evil Morty is going to be big bad, and there's going to be a big giant battle between these two, because this is like an anime, right? And immediately Rick and Morty are like, this is actually really stupid. Let's not do that at all. And let's, because of how dumb this is and how cliche it is, let's actually have the power of Christ to save us from this situation in order to get out of this silly storytelling.
About that. Yeah.
And so I think it's also kind of the writer saying in that episode, hey, we very well could do this. We are actively choosing not to, because that is not what makes this show this show.
Yeah.
That this show is constantly sort of setting up expectations and simultaneously doing exactly as you expected, but also breaking them in every sense of the word.
Yeah.
And that is what this show keeps on doing time in and time out.
Yeah.
So I think what speaks to that theory that you brought up, that Morty is in cahoots with evil Morty, right? I think it's at least possible, because what the show does well is that you never really know where it's going in terms of its storytelling. And so it is very possible for one avenue of the story for Morty to completely turn against Rick, because he has every reason to. But there's also a completely plausible avenue too, where Morty would never turn against Rick.
Yeah.
Because he is the Mortiest of Mortys, and he's the Rickiest of Ricks.
Right.
And they would, and the bond between Rick and Morty is inseparable.
And let me tell you, that's like the running joke. Is that they stare at each other and they're like, it's going to last forever, Morty, it's going to last forever. And then Morty's just like seizing on the ground or whatever, like they do at the end of every season.
Exactly.
So there's one thing that I see on your notepad that we haven't gotten to yet that I really need you to explain.
Okay.
And it's going to be your gold medal.
My gold medal is very easy, at least to me, because even when I first watched this show with a group of friends a few years ago, the first 3 seasons, and then I rewatched it these past couple of weeks, the first 3 seasons plus the 4th season, it is very strong to me that my gold medal is the actor that plays as Jerry, Chris Parnell. And I suppose it's also mostly just Jerry, because for some reason, I love the straight man. The straight man, I don't literally love straight men.
I love bringing them out. No.
The straight man, in comedic purposes, is sort of somebody who is kind of there to like connect with the audience, right? So something as crazy as this show, where you have this completely selfish, insane individual that is Rick, and this really insecure but kind of quirky and strange and awkward character that is Morty, but they're kind of hard to relate to, as opposed to Jerry, who's a lot easier to relate to because of how boring he is.
Yes.
And so, mind you, the show does constantly make jokes about how lame and how much of a loser Jerry is, and they kind of make that joke every single episode. There was one episode at one point that I kind of wasn't really paying attention, and Summer, who I already said is Morty's sister, insulted her father, and I wasn't really paying attention. And my roommate, Sam, was like, hey, that was actually a really sick burn. You should rewind. And I'm like, it's probably just her making fun of Jerry, which happens every episode, but fine. And I mean, it's exactly that, right? Like, it's hitting every note that they need to hit to make Jerry an absolute effing loser throughout this show. But that's also why I love Jerry so much. How much of an immense loser he is, that he sort of harkens back to the sitcom dad, but it's this version of the sitcom dad that is also completely effing useless.
Right.
That is the worst part to the family dynamic. That is an absolute coward. He has no idea what he's doing more than half the time.
Yeah.
And
it's very relatable in that way, though.
Yes. And especially, like, when you... I mean, listen, if you in reality were next to somebody like Rick and were next to somebody like Morty, maybe you wouldn't be as much of a loser as Jerry, but you'd certainly be as confused as Jerry with how to solve problems.
Right.
And when I can imagine when your wife is constantly choosing her neglectful father over you, I'm sure that could also be very, very confusing.
Yeah, right.
Like, this man clearly has no capacity for love.
Right.
And yet you are constantly turning into him, and you refuse to acknowledge it.
And like, he is genuinely so stubborn and ignorant that they actually depend on him to be that way and to be this loser in order for the story to move along, or in order for things to make sense for them. So, for instance, there's an episode where Rick and Morty and Summer freeze time and have like a fantastic, like, several
2 months.
years. Yeah, we're right.
You're about to say years.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. But it was 2 months. You're right. And they have like a good ass time. But they trash the place, and so they have to, like, clean everything back up and then unfreeze time. And when they unfreeze time, they did everything right, except they accidentally put Jerry's shirt on backwards. And so he's walking up the stairs, and they're like, oh my gosh, we're about to get away with it. And then the mom is like, Jerry, is your shirt on backwards?
And they start pissing their pants. They're like, oh, no.
They're like, oh, my gosh. Oh, it's all up. Like, they're going to know that something's up. And then Jerry just turns around and is like, I know that. I like it that way. And, and walks up the stairs because he wants so bad to seem smarter than he is, because he's insecure about his intelligence, because his wife's dad is the smartest man in the universe.
And is always the biggest asshole in the room.
Yeah. And so he wants to feel like he has
and
control
everybody
over
loves Rick, and he will never understand that.
Right. Which, how can you blame him?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
And that's kind of why I love his character so much, that he is simultaneous. Oh my god, what just happened to my throat?
I don't know. Are you okay?
Just, like,
Do I need to call 911?
It was like, you know those locks in, like, the Panama Canal? That's sort of what happened.
Oh my god.
And it just stopped, and that ship is stuck right there. That's partially why entirely why I love Jerry. Is he is simultaneously this straight man, and also he's just complete moronic loser.
Yeah.
And how seriously he takes every situation. And it's fun, at least for me sometimes, to love the character that everybody in the show hates. And it's sometimes you look at Jerry and it's like, how can you not love that guy? Like, you just want to pinch his cheek sometimes. Yeah. And that is why I love Jerry, and I love Chris Parnell's interpretation of that character, because it's to such a point I cannot imagine any other voice or actor being that role.
Yeah.
It's this sort of voice that has this commanding tone to it. Like, I can lead a room, but how this voice sort of leaks and reeks in this lack of self-confidence simultaneously. It is immaculate. How it just... and it exudes off the screen. And I think it does an incredibly good job when the show... with how it approaches Jerry's character.
I can understand that, and I can see why that would be a gold medal performance for you. That's such a special performance and character that really kept the show glued together for you. I can understand that. So in closing, what are your final thoughts on Rick and Morty thus far, and how you think they're going to take the show in the future, which I'm sure is going to be several years before we get the next season?
Sometimes this show, I do think, is kind of boring because the jokes themselves are not very good. The show gets stronger later on. I think we should have addressed this earlier, but I think season 2 is pretty weak. And I think a big part of that is, like, a lot of season 2 has these, like, wacky songs in it. And the songs are really, really bad. Yeah. And so it just sucks to hear them because not only are they not funny, but they're also just not fun to listen to.
Yeah.
But the show...
Let's call it spade a spade. Get Swifty.
Get Swifty is a really bad episode. Get Swifty is just a bad episode.
I might agree with you.
And the only parts of that episode that is strong is all of a sudden Ice-T is actually an alien.
Ice-T.
From Alphabetron or something, or is actually Water T.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that glues that episode together, right? And it's not the Get Swifty song that all the cool kids are singing. I love Rick and Morty. Get Swifty. Raise the posterior. I hate those people.
Oh, yeah. Which is, we know a lot.
We know a lot.
Yeah.
And it's an issue. And if you're one of those people, you should stop that, please.
Yeah.
Because, look, the show is funny, but it's not funny when you shove it down my throat like a pickle Rick.
Like a pickle Rick. Nice.
A pick. So... but that being said, I think the show is best appreciated when you're watching it with a group of people. I think the show isn't as strong the second time you view it because the jokes are really good the first time and the shock value is very good the first time. And they sort of lose its luster a second time because the jokes themselves are not incredibly clever. And a lot of it is shock value.
Sure.
But with that being said, I think this show does an incredible job in telling comedy and have really interesting underlying themes and story beats and having writers that absolutely know what the hell this show is. And they definitely really find their footing in the 3rd and 4th season, where this is a show that is shit and we love it for that. And when we want to tell like an actual meaningful / serious story, we'll tell that for 30 seconds and we'll immediately dip because that's what this show is. Yep. And if you expect anything different, that's on you.
Sure.
So I will probably keep watching the 5th season whenever, the next few seasons come out. I'm not sort of at the edge of my seat for it. But I still appreciate the stupid artistry that is with this show. Mac, what are your closing thoughts with how it relates to Rick and Morty?
I think that I'm definitely excited for season 5, and I am at the edge of my seat purely because of one person, and that is Dan Harmon.
We hardly even addressed that.
Yeah, I know. But I will say that, I have talked about Dan Harmon on the show before, and to briefly sum up my viewpoint on Dan Harmon, I think that even though he is not the absolute best, especially in terms of dialogue, but in terms of ideas, just simply ideas and concept writing, he is the best that I can think of. He is maybe the most creative and free writer working today. I really, really do believe that. He does not give a shit and will do literally whatever he wants. And it's amazing. I really do think that that's difficult to find these days. And I tip my hat to that. Purely knowing that he is going to be attached to it and he's going to be a part of the writing process and that he's never going to stop being a part of the writing process, I will always be interested in the crazy shit that he conjures up in his mind.
It is incredibly impressive when you see a creative storytelling team that has these stupid situations and the conflict is very, very real for some of these characters.
Yeah. And he is the king of that. I mean, if you look at Community, if you look at this, and and every movie that he's ever been a part of. It's consistently absolutely insane. I've never even thought of that or considered that as a possibility type of situations, but rooted in all of the technique that we know and love, that we were brought up with. Yeah, and that's always impressive to me and exciting. So that's why I'm going to stay invested. Now, moving on to next week, I think it's fair to say.
I mean, we're going to look at the season 4
Yeah, we have to.
of The Wire. We're almost done. We're almost there. Season 3 was really strong.
Oh, yeah.
Coincidentally, both Mac and I have yet to start it. That snowstorm last week, I know I'm dating this podcast, did not help our situation when it comes to viewing pleasures. But now we can really get this show on the road. So.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you.
No, stop it.
No, you stop it.
Stop.
Thank you.